Hello and welcome to the very first episode of a new podcast series called Football: The Imperfect Game, the show that takes a closer look at the beautiful game's imperfections. Today's episode will be a discussion about the psychology of gambling addiction, what makes people gamble, and we'll also be taking a look at some of the psychological effects that gambling advertisements and sponsorships can have on audiences. But we can't just have a discussion with just myself, so today's guest is an expert on addiction and especially gambling addiction. He's completed a Master's in Psychology and has contributed to research about gambling addictions. It's great to have Dr Greg Westerman-Hughes as a guest for today's episode. Greg, thank you very much for taking the time to come onto the podcast today.
Thank you.
To start things off, I wanted to ask about the primary reason for perhaps putting a bet on a football game to begin with. Is it the fact that people are wanting to create some excitement about a game that perhaps they're watching at home and they're watching as a neutral fan, and it might be a little bit dull, maybe even a little bit of a boring watch?
I mean, it's definitely one of the things. I'd hesitate to say which one is the most indicative or the most or the strongest predictor. Like I was saying, because there is quite a number of them. But definitely excitement and definitely things related to like social aspects. I'm saying it kind of falls within that mastery motivation a little bit, but it's sort of one of these things where, I mean, again, you probably have an experience of this as well, which is friends love to brag or they love to talk about how much they won on an accumulator, or you'll see on Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook pictures of people with accumulators or bets on with, the fiver or the £10 they've put on, or and the £2,000 that they might get out. You'll always as well probably only hear about the wins.
Yeah.
A weekend or whatever, and it's like, oh yeah, I won 200 quid on this accumulator, and obviously the conversation goes, oh that's amazing. How much did you put on? He's like, oh, I only put on £1, and I got 200 quid from it. It's like, oh, that's paid for this weekend. That that's going towards my holiday, and that's your typical conversation that you'd have. But obviously they're not telling you about the losses. They're not telling you about how many bets they've put on through the week. They're not telling you how much they've actually lost over multiple weekends. You'll only hear about the odd win now and again. So I think there's definitely a social aspect to it in terms of being able to be involved in a conversation with people about football, about, again, what you've been up to, the fact that you've been winning money and you've got money. I think that definitely is an aspect to it. But like I was saying, that there is others as well. I mean, detachment and escape is a very big one. Takes you, again, you everyone deals with stress and deals with issues in their life. Like I say, you make decisions every day, and detachment is that need to escape, or that need to not focus or concentrate on the real life and real problems. It's sort of that taking you out of the situation, the way you're feeling, and focus just on the game or focus on the gamble. That is one of the big predictors is that people get very stressed. Again, whether it's through their job, through a partner, peers, just making decisions. It could be something as simple as you had something planned and it fell through, and now you feel frustrated or angry or a bit sad by what happened, and it's kind of then sort of like a need or a means of coping and dealing with those negative feelings. Or sometimes can be things like boredom. If you had something planned, it fell through, you've now got all this time. Well, you need to fill that time with something in order to sleep and then have the next day where you might have something then planned. So it sort of feeds into each other, and obviously over time this can lead to like conditioning, or what they also call like cognitive schemas, where you basically condition yourself or think, when you're in an instance where you feel sad or you've got some spare time and you're bored and you may be frustrated or angry, or your automatic or somewhat of an unconscious thought is, well, I'll just get my phone out and I'll place a bet.
Is that sort of like a big problem where it all starts off with, is, well, sort of how easy it actually is to just place a bet now? Like, gone are the days where like you'd have to go to like a bookmaker shop and actually place one over the counter. You can literally just take out your phone and you can literally gamble on like any sport, almost any country in the world at like any level.
Absolutely. I mean, accessibility and being able to obviously literally just pull your phone out and bet is definitely a contributor towards it. Um, I mean, again, there are obviously a lot of, well, there's supposed to be, obviously there's definitely examples of companies unfortunately preying on, or maybe not preying on, that's maybe too much of a strong word, but at least letting some of those regulations slip, um, to, to to garner and gauge more money off people. But there's supposed to be obviously restrictions for your accounts. So there's supposed to be rigorous background checks, or at least some sort of check to ensure you are not going to spend over a certain amount, or you can obviously place high or a lot of bets in a short space of time. But there's always means and ways of getting around it. Like I say, with before, if you went into William Hill and you sort of bet a limit with them, or you bet and somebody saw that you were getting distressed and upset, and they said, I think enough's now, or you had people around you sort of again giving you those cues, the likelihood is that once you're done, you're done. You're just going to go home. Whereas with your phone, well, you could go on the William Hill app, play some bets on there, and then you could close that app down and then go on Bet365 and play some bets on there. And you could just keep doing that over and over again. It's literally a case of pressing your home button, then pressing another app. And as long as you've got obviously an account with that organization, you could just keep going, um, which again is definitely problematic. I mean, what the solution is with that, I don't know. I mean, you'll probably have a much clearer idea once you've spoken to obviously a multitude of different people, because legally it's very difficult to enforce, because again it comes down to, well, they're providing a service, they're doing more than what I would suspect other services are in terms of trying to protect and safeguard people, and it's then up to that individual who then engages with that, whether or not they place that bet, or they hit their limit and then stop, or extend that limit the next week. It's a very slippery slope with regards to responsibility, but fundamentally it comes down to the individual. And I think it's more important to understand why they're wanting to place that bet in the first place than all the other things. Don't get me wrong, that these other things do obviously contribute towards susceptibility, or contribute towards continuous and frequent use. But fundamentally, as somebody obviously works and understands it from a psychological perspective, I think understanding why the individual wants to use gambling apps or gambling as a sort of means of dealing with issues, or to relieve some form of negative affect is much more important, because I think ideally you'd want to put them onto a more adaptive means of coping, or a more healthier sort of habit behavior to deal with those frustrations, or to deal with that negative affect.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, again, we can't live in a world where we don't address these complexities and address the things of advertising, and again how they fall somehow into being within your eye line and constantly being there, whether it's advertisements before and after games, or in between breaks within games, whether it's shirt sponsorships, whether it's buying stadium rights, whether it's sponsoring again events, and being sponsors of big events. It's difficult, especially as well when you consider how much money a lot of these gambling organizations make. um,
Yeah.
it's a legal nightmare, really, because it's sort of saying, well, why is it okay for Coca-Cola to sponsor it, but not, um, you know, Bet365 or Ladbrokes or whoever, if they've got the money and they're paying. I mean, there is definitely an ethical question there, but it's a difficult one.
What's sort of the process that's happening in like someone's mind? You know, when they see like these gambling advertisements and sponsorships in sports, for example, how much like influence does that actually have on people?
Again, I would suspect most of it is subconscious in the sense where it's like with any advertising. I mean, if you speak to anybody with advertising,
Yeah,
or a customer or somebody who watches it, it's never usually, you see an advert for, you see Ray Winston sort of say, don't place a bet, and then all of a sudden you think, oh yeah, I'm going to go place a bet. I think it's a bit more of a subconscious thing. Like you've already kind of maybe thought about it, or you already have got a bet on, and so it kind of then is just a prompt, a bit of a trigger in a way where it's like, well, you could put a bet on if you want to. Look how easy it is. Or your first free bet, you get £20 free. It's initiatives and things like that where I think it's much more of an influence on people when they have such things like that,
yeah,
where it's everywhere. It's kind of a light bulb in a way, or a kind of a trigger just for people where it's like, well, you could place a bet if you wanted to. And I think that's mainly where it comes from. It's that familiarity. It's the fact that it's everywhere. It's a constant prompt to you that gambling, you can gamble. Gambling is okay here because look at all these different gambling sort of organizations that we're affiliated with, or whatever. And obviously that's a two-way street as well. Obviously one from the actual club itself, as well as obviously from the gambling organisations, and obviously those who sell the TV rights to obviously have those advertisements and those things there. So I think it's just a constant reminder, or a constant trigger there for people who somewhat can already be susceptible to these things of wanting to gamble, that I think it's just a means of reminding or triggering people to remember, you can always place a bet if you want to. And in most cases, I think people probably do, because it adds to that excitement. It adds to that social. It adds to
yeah.
that. I'm no longer focusing on what I'm feeling. I'm just focusing on the game, and then I'm focusing on, oh God, there's 3 yellow cards, and my bet pays out when I get 4. And so the focus then becomes on that rather than everything else. And I think that brings quite a number of people relief and contentment in that moment, in that context of what they're doing. In which case, it's same watching football and enjoying having that bet on.
Are the triggers the same to the same sort of severity as they are for, say, someone that might be actually addicted to gambling, and that they just can't
Yeah,
stop betting? Is that sort of the same, or does it differ?
I mean, from the advertiser themselves or from the organization, it is the same, right? But it's obviously the individual who would feel more susceptible. So if you've already, again, it's kind of like, it's kind of seen as like a journey, or at least like a continuum, a sort of a scale, if you want to call it that, where you're going to have individuals obviously on the early side of things where they only place a bet on the Grand National, and they occasionally maybe do a scratch card or something. To those sort of in the middle who maybe have one or two accounts, who occasionally place a bet. It's only on their team, or it's only on general outcomes, or things within the game, and then progressively, I suppose if you could use the word tolerance in a sense, where it's not enough and then they need more. So down that further or extreme end, you've now got somebody who's got multiple accounts betting every time or every weekend on games. They're much more specific. So the thing is again, I think the susceptibility of the individual is probably what the advertising and those effects are going to have more strongly. Um, that also, I think, is probably reflected in the individual's circumstance as well. Obviously, psychologically, how much are they needing in terms of that gratification, in terms of that relief from all those negative affects, that stress, that distress, frustration, anger, whatever it may be. Um, I think that's also going to have a big influence on how much somebody engages with gambling. It's kind of one of these things where, if you're having a really bad and rough day, the only thing you really want to do is just sit and chill out. You just want you do anything just to have that peace and that relaxation where you're no longer feeling angsty and worked up and stressed. You don't want, I mean, you don't have those intense feelings anymore. And I think if you're in that situation where one, you already know gambling works for you, you are in that heightened state of frustration and needing relief from that negative affect. I think having somebody advertise or say to you, or put a bet on, or do you know what the odds are for winning this? They're really good. Why don't you just stick a couple of quid on? I think it's all those combination of making it very easy, very accessible, very fun and reinforcing with the circumstance of the individual that just creates a very destructive and unhealthy means of basically gambling and leading to much more severe and destructive problems. I mean, obviously, finances is the biggest outcome when it comes to gambling, which obviously has a much larger and greater knock-on effect than, say, gaming disorder, or even to some extent some substances. Obviously, physically, substances are going to have a massive effect, as well as some finances, obviously. But gambling, obviously, predominantly it's the finances, which obviously has, I say, massive knock-on effects with being able to survive and live, not being homeless, having fights and breakdowns of relationships, being able to eat. There's a significant amount of harm there when it comes to being in the hole where you've lost all your money and you're chasing to try and get it back.
Yeah. When it gets to that sort of level where, you know, gamblers are sort of in that fight, they're sort of at a point where they're spent like so much of their finance and income has gone to into gambling. Um, how, what makes them, think, right? I'm not going to stop here. I've got to keep on gambling to, Is there an element of chasing your wins at that point, or is that just very like really severe?
I mean, people can chase their wins from the off. I mean, as soon as you've lost once, you can potentially be chasing your wins from there. Um,
Yeah,
Sometimes it's disguised in the sense where they actually do want to continue gambling, but or don't necessarily want to admit that they're chasing the losses. Um, but it can pretty much start from the off. Um, when it gets to such a severe situation where they don't have money to gamble anymore, obviously then it's a case of the individual will turn to much more nefarious and somewhat criminal means of obviously acquiring that money. Um, Again, it could be things like I said, stealing. It could be borrowing or lending money, whether that's from friends or family or from payday loans, from loan sharks. Um, you get into a real bad situation there where you it's not going to get better for you, and you're in a real problem. And obviously bailouts in terms of people or friends buying your debt out, um, is probably one of the worst things you can do for somebody who is a gambling addict. As much as it feels like you are helping them and you're relieving some of that pressure or stress, typically what happens is the individual recognizes that you are their fallback or their safety net, and it's really an awful situation because obviously friends and family want to just help the person, but inadvertently by helping them you actually are contributing to the issue because the individual may see that, oh, it's okay for me to get into debt because I know that if I do, then I'm going to get bailed out by my partner or by my parents or something to that extent, which just kind of reinforces the acceptability of betting and going again. and getting yourself into that situation again, because, well, the responsibility then falls on my parents or my partner to bail me out again. So it's again, it's not a very nice situation to be in. And so, again, I caveat that with, if the individual is seeking help in therapy or doing something towards reducing the amount that they gamble or stopping gambling, as well as then obviously somebody helping and dealing financially with their issues, then I kind of maybe can see or get on board with that sort of plan. Um, but if the person isn't making steps towards recovery or trying to get better, the likelihood is that they will see it as a safety net and continue to keep gambling, and sometimes worse, because they know they've got that safety net there.
What are some of the recovery like practices? Um, with people dealing with addiction, like what sort of advice are they given to by professionals to sort of help them psychology in like their road to recovery?
In most cases, it's CBT. Um, Within most addiction, it's CBT, which is obviously cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses predominantly on changing their perception or their intensity of their sort of feelings and emotions towards certain things. So in this case, if it is gambling or it's an element that they're particularly susceptible to, it's changing the way that they feel or cope. It's trying to break down that sort of unconscious or subconscious conditioning that they've sort of established within their sort of behavior or their mindset, which is, when I feel bad, I gamble because it makes me feel better, or I always feel bad, and when I do gamble, it makes me feel normal, or it makes me feel contented. CBT aims to try and break down that thought process. So instead of, when they do feel that particular emotion, their automatic or their thought process doesn't wander or go towards gambling as a means of relieving or dealing with those feelings or those thoughts. And it's supposed to progressively over time, I say, break that down or put them onto more, saying, adaptive means. So, when you feel stressed or you worked up or angry, you go and speak to somebody and you talk these things through, or you go to the gym, or you go for a walk, or you take up another hobby or something like that, instead of obviously going to a betting site and placing a gamble. It's There are, I believe, NHS, not many, but there are NHS treatment centres or providers by the NHS for gambling, um, but predominantly the ones that are provided are private organisations and charities, um, and they all kind of focus on a similar thing. Again, I don't know whether you know much about the literature within addiction, but basically, most of the literature is all based on substances and substance misuse. And then all of the understanding and the diagnostic criteria has then basically been transposed into gambling. A few minor changes, not many. I think there's probably two criteria that are different, I think, as well as the number of criteria that has to be endorsed. And then basically from gambling, it's now been transposed into gaming. And I think at current, there's probably an argument, or at least within the field, looking to try and then apply that to social media at the moment, because it seems to be a very topical issue, social media use, social media disorder, and that I think is being worked into there. So predominantly, a lot of the knowledge and means of which understanding treatment comes from substances. Um, but fundamentally, it comes down to understanding the cause of why that individual is gambling to such obviously detrimental and harmful levels, and trying to manage and deal with that. Again, it's not necessarily always as simple as I feel like crap, so I gamble. Like I say, it can be a whole multitude of different things. It can be things like autonomy. So if a person doesn't feel like they have control of their life, they have a very stressful job, or they have people telling them what to do with their job all the time. They don't really have any freedom or agency to make choices and decisions that have an effect or any sort of impact on themselves. Sometimes they can use gambling as a means of relieving themselves from having that choice, or they are making the choice, and so there's no control over the outcome when they place a gamble and place a bet. So again, it's different for different people. Obviously, people will gamble to deal with
Yeah.
different issues, and it's fundamentally trying to understand what those issues are and resolve them, and consequently, the gambling should somewhat reduce or cease. Um, Much easier said than done, obviously. These things are obviously developed over a long period of time, and when there are such triggers, such as advertising and again people and peers around you that also may be gambling or may also be talking about things, it's hard not to maybe want to gamble or be involved with it when everyone else is, and it's so somewhat normalized around you when you've got, say, them buying stadium rights and advertising on the TV, and everywhere you go, it seems to be associated with gambling to some extent.
Mm. What are some of the key psychological differences between people in that sort of 18 to 25 age range? What are some of the key differences between them and like fully grown adults, perhaps?
I mean, disposable income and responsibility, um, probably as well impulsivity, bit of conscientiousness as well. So obviously, those who are much older will maybe have much more responsibility. They may have a house and kids to look after. So it means they probably not get as much disposable income, or they have to think about their kid rather than just themselves. Impulsivity again probably comes into that just through experience and maturity, I suppose, but more experience, because I suppose that's what makes you mature, is that you understand the consequences of which you can rationalize and be more logical and thoughtful in obviously what it is you do and why. Um, Again, you may be in that situation where you're in a relationship, or you're at least living with people that can obviously care about you, that can have a somewhat of a watchful eye on you. Obviously, between 18 and 25, the likelihood is that you're going to be single. You're probably going to be living on your own. Obviously, if you're at university or you're starting out as your first job, um, you're not going to necessarily have those individuals around you that are constantly watching or checking up on you and checking in. Vice versa, you don't necessarily
Mm.
have those people to confide and talk to. Men are obviously disproportionately affected more than women, and I don't necessarily like to bring in the gender differences, but I think you can't necessarily ignore the fact that I think men take much more riskier decisions or engage themselves in much more risky behaviour. Um,
Is there a reason why that's the case?
I mean, I don't know whether it's again. I'm always tentative to go into such things like genetical, hormonal differences and such like that. Um, but obviously, on average, I would probably say men are typically more impulsive, less sort of logical, more um, in the moment, spontaneous, spur of the moment type thing, where it's again susceptibility to peer pressure, a susceptibility to wanting excitement, wanting relief from stress, and wanting to fit in. I think there's a whole combination of things that, if you really wanted to get into it, which again I'm not entirely comfortable with, because again of the situation and the culture that we're in currently, to make such definitive things about, you know, this, I just think there's a whole combination of things there, both expectations with regards to um, probably the way men are supposed to act or share things and not share things. All those things I suppose you would stereotypically associate with men and their behaviour probably somewhat falls true, but doesn't necessarily obviously explain the entire picture. Um, again, it's typically, I think it's just what you'd expect. It's typically young adult males that have probably got quite a lot of disposable income. They're maybe still living with their parents. They've got their first job, or they're at university. They've got obviously grant money and stuff coming in, and they think it's something to play around with. Or again, they're within the culture of British drinking culture, which is again going out, socialising with mates. They're probably engaged in sports, whether it's rugby, football, badminton, whatever it may be, and consequentially, by being involved in those sports, you're having those conversations with people of a similar age, and it only takes necessarily one person to do it or start doing it, and it spreads like wildfire because, well, fear of missing out is also a very big indicator. People don't want to miss out. They don't want to feel excluded from the conversation or excluded from the group. So the likelihood is that they're going to engage or try and fit in, and not miss out on these sorts of conversations or these sorts of group dynamics, if you want to call them, because again, it doesn't feel nice. It doesn't feel good. It's unfortunately that age group, 18 to 25, is a very defining period within individuals' development and socialization. It's a period where you developing and understanding who you are. You've got a lot of freedoms. You've got a lot of choice and things that you can now engage with, obviously legally, as well as obviously a lot of changing circumstances within your life as well. There's a lot of big decisions that get made in that period of time, and I think that probably also contributes to certain behaviours or decisions that people make. Again, in most cases, I think you kind of already said it with that accessibility and that availability type thing, is if you've got a bunch of mates who are not very reliable and have got their own things going on, and you were basically sat bored at home not doing anything, the likelihood is that you're going to engage in something that is really easy and really reinforcing to fill in that time or fill in that boredom, fill in that low sort of state you're in because you're not able to socialize and go out with your mates, or you've got no one around. So it's I think it's a very vulnerable age to be in, because there's a lot of change and a lot of, I suppose, getting used to adult life, I think, at that sort of period within your life.
The idea of free bets, does that have, who's that sort of targeted towards? Does that have any influence on perhaps younger adults or compared to older adults?
I mean, I think it probably affects. I mean, targeting wise, I'm not sure. Obviously, again, I don't know whether or not there's a particular initiative there, to try and obviously target certain demographics or certain types of people. I would suspect it's individuals who are on the fence about gambling, who are maybe teetering with the idea, but just want a bit of a teaser. I suppose it's a bit like the free sample at a supermarket or a free sample at a market, a farm, or whatever, where it's a case of, I'll try this, see if you like it, and then you'll buy the full product. I think it's a kind of similar situation with free bets. It's kind of teasing you in with, set up an account or refer a friend. You'll get £20 or a £10 first free bet. And I think that is sort of just in trying to entice users. I think it's in trying to entice new people to gamble, but I think it's probably those people who are on the fence because, well, if you've already got multiple accounts and you're already gambling, 20 quid is probably minimal, or a £10 free bet is probably minimal in consideration of how much you are betting already. So I think most people who are gambling would probably still take it if they are obviously eligible to take it. But I think from an advertising perspective, or probably what the organisations and companies are trying to do is tease those individuals who are maybe on the fence about gambling or putting a bet on, and giving them that little push, I suppose, into saying, well, oh look, we'll give you some free money to bet with, so it's not your money
Yeah.
that you're betting with. Um, but I think everybody understands and knows that chasing is definitely a very strong feeling, a very strong pull for individuals, that it's sometimes very difficult to differentiate between what's your money and what's their money, as well as how much you're up versus how much you're down. You'd have to take yourself out of that mindset or situation in order to sort of rationalize or understand that. There's a study that I was involved with that it's kind of based on that idea. They I think they call it like the red mist or like a blinkered effect, where once you're involved in the game or involved in the gamble, everything else becomes periphery. It's kind of a very solemn focus on the gamble and what you're doing, and everything else becomes just, well, it just dissipates. It just doesn't become something that you pay attention to. Kind of a bit like, when you're enjoying yourself and you're involved in something, 2 or 3 hours can fly by and you've had no idea that such a large amount of time has passed. Kind of that similar sort of thing where they're just so engrossed and involved in the behaviour in the gamble that nothing else sort of is being paid attention to. And of course, that leads to a lot of problems because you're not taking yourself out of the situation, rationalizing or understanding what is happening, what is going on, how much money you started with, how much you're at now, how much you've won, how much you've lost. Should you stop? Should you not? And obviously, there are certain games that employ breaks or in-session breaks where it'll say, oh, you've been playing this game for 2 hours now. Do you want to take a break, or you should take a break? And in which case you just press continue and carry on. Those sorts of breaks or those situations where it takes you out of the game and out of the gamble are quite important. But again, it's a very difficult thing to implement, and I'm not so sure many organisations probably want to do that too, which is again probably part of the issue and problem as well, is that it is just constant. It's advertising and talking about it and always being there on your phone, etc. That I think makes things far too easy to just keep going back to.
Is there any sort of withdrawal symptoms with people addicted to gamblers in a similar way to perhaps alcohol addictions and drug addictions?
So there is. It's not. It's usually sort of expressed or explained as not necessarily being akin, so not being exactly the same in the sense of that physical dependency and that cold turkey, the shakes, the sweats, and that sort of thing. But certainly from a psychological perspective, there is. So what it comes down to is it's that sort of gratification or that needs frustration that an individual is obviously experiencing. It's that lack of relief, lack of sort of coping in a way. So again, it's not necessarily anything to do with the money. It's to do with having that need or having that negative affect and it needing to be relieved, and those feelings just constantly becoming more intense, more frequent, and needing to find a way to feel not like that anymore and to deal with those emotions. So I think from a gambling perspective, it's probably more frustration. It's probably more low mood or sadness, probably anger. Um, think of it in a sense where you've had a crap day and you can't gamble. How are you going to feel?
Yeah, you're gonna feel pretty crap.
Yeah, and that's going to progress over a period of time. So think you've had a crap day, then you go to work the next day. You've had a crap day, and then this time you've had an argument with your partner. So now you're feeling even worse, and you're going to need an outlet for that. It's only natural. It's only a normal thing to want to not feel bad and feel negative, and you need to find a vice or something that is going to make you feel better, relieve those symptoms. And unfortunately, I personally feel, as well as sort of what my research has sort of pushed me towards, and is that unfortunately, we have a generation that has kind of been given everything and hasn't gone out and done or experienced things. And I say that in the sense where quite a number of people who I've spoken to that my background on my sort of thesis and stuff was on gaming disorder, but originally I saying I looked at gambling. The majority of young adults don't have a hobby, and they don't, and some of them or most of them after 16 when they leave school don't engage in any sports. So the thing is they don't have an outlet. They don't have a means of coping, or they don't necessarily do anything besides sit and watch TV, watch Netflix, and maybe some read or maybe some draw, but nothing that is potentially fulfilling on the long term, has sort of a long term payoff or something that they can be proud of and say, well, look what I've done. I've been working towards this. Look how proud I am that I've achieved this and done this. I think most young adults and most people within that area and that generation just don't seem to have anything. Um, on top of the fact they just a lot of it is fear. They don't know what's out there. They feel like it's a waste of time trying to find out. The cost benefit in terms of going out and trying something, maybe paying 25, 50 quid and seeing whether or not they like it is not worth it. They could just stay at home and turn the Xbox on, or they could just sit and binge watch Netflix until they have to do something the next day. Um, they may socialize, but it's very surface level. It's not very deep or meaningful. It's very casual sort of acquaintances. Oh, how you doing? Yeah, I'm good. You? Yeah, what you been up to? That's it. I think there's also a big issue as well currently, and I don't know whether it plays into it, but probably does somewhat. Is that there was a lot of young single males. Not a lot of people are getting into relationships, and I think that also contributes towards it as well. Because you've got nobody then. You've got nobody to spend time with, nobody to talk to, nobody to go and enjoy and have those shared experiences with. And so you're sat on your own, alone, at home, either with your parents or in your own domicile with your own accommodation. You need an outlet, you need something to do. And when you've got a phone there that you can go on multiple apps and
Yeah.
gamble and know it gives you a decent buzz, it, it kind of seems like a no brainer, really, when you look at it. But I think this is again, it's an amalgamation of all these different things that I think contribute towards it, especially for that demographic. Um, and something has to change. It really does. But again, it's not something that's going to change necessarily overnight, and not something that you can necessarily force and change. It's 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 something that I think again you can ask the gambling organisations to reduce the advertising. You can ask them to put more restrictions or freedoms, I suppose, towards the customer and the user with regards to how much they want to use a particular app or how much they want to gamble. But I think fundamentally it comes down to the individual, um, and again why they are gambling into such detrimental lengths. It's a very difficult and complex thing, but I think fundamentally trying to understand why they do it, um, and given a different sort of outlet or a different behavior to engage in is probably the most effective way of dealing with the issue and having them not progress to a level that is detrimental and that severe that, like I say, they're in significant amount of debt and they're doing very, very risky and very dangerous things in order to recuperate or pay off that debt.
Just to sort of finish up things, the government are bringing out a white paper which is going to sort of update the laws on gambling in the United Kingdom for the first time since 2005. Is this something that's is it something that's needed, or perhaps is it not going to change enough?
I mean, it depends what it is that they're targeting. I can't, I don't really know what the white paper is addressing. Um, I've not read it myself. Do you know briefly what it's looking at?
It's going to get published later on this year, but a lot of it seems to be focused around limiting how much one person can like stake on a bet. I think a lot of it is around slot machines,
Hmm.
sort of limiting how much people can bet on it.
Right. Okay. I mean, I tell my students, and I think the literature probably again supports me in saying that in most cases it doesn't matter whether you're gambling with a penny, a pound, or 10 or £100. It's the act of gambling that is the reinforcer or the reason why people gamble. The money is kind of a secondary sort of reinforcer. Um, I think it will help in regards to obviously people getting to such depths of financial difficulties and issues, which again is one of the bigger contributors to the problem and to severe consequences and issues afterwards. But I think fundamentally people will find ways around it, will find loopholes because people do. Um, it may well be that it's saying at the moment the average number of accounts is about 4 or 5. So as soon as they hit their limit with one, they move on to the next one. What's to say that it doesn't extend to creating different email addresses, creating different identities, having multiple bank accounts? Then you can have 10 accounts. So it as much as the intention is probably well founded for trying to address these sorts of issues, again fundamentally it's dealing with the symptoms and not the causes. You're looking at trying to deal with limiting the amount that people can bet, when really you should be looking at, well, why are they betting in the first place? Like I sort of said, gambling in and of itself is not harmful. It's not an addiction. It is a form of entertainment, and it is a means of people engaging in behavior to feel excitement. It's not inherently harmful, but for those individuals that are susceptible and are using it disorderly, they will continue to use it disorderly, not because of how much they can bet, but because they can bet, and because they can do it as much as they want all the time at their fingertips. So I think it will delay potential issues that are related to finances and getting into such a hole with your finances that again have such massive knock-on effects with to do same with upkeep and keeping a house, getting your rent paid, feeding yourself, um, all of the arguments and conversations that obviously come with parents, peers, partners in relation to that. Um, but fundamentally, I think it's only going to delay the issue because, well, all it's if it does work for those individuals who can't now place, 1,000, £10,000 bets, and you can only place £500 bets per day, it just means they'll be playing every day on multiple accounts, trying to get that fix and that high, that rush that they're obviously seeking, and then they'll just find means and ways of getting around it. Um, the worry is if it is effective. Again, I don't think it's going to stop people from gambling because obviously you're never going to be able to do that. The worst worry is that
Yeah,
it pushes people towards something else, and that something else is more harmful. That is a big concern or a big worry, especially when it comes to regulation. Because if I can no longer get my relief and my high from gambling as much as I did, there's now restrictions where I can't get that same level of gratification. I'm going to find some other way or some other means of finding it, and you just hope that that's not something like a substance or much more risky behaviors, um, like crime or again. You don't know. You can't never predict these things. What goes through
right, yeah.
people's minds when they're in that state of such negativity or such low mood, what it is they'll do. You, you, you're taking away that means of coping. I mean, it's it's a very difficult thing to deal with. I mean, I've got a good example where um, I won't state the place or anything, but there's a particular place that I volunteer, and they don't try and stop people from self harming. And the reason why they don't try and stop them is because it's their form of relief, their form of coping, and their form of dealing with the feelings and emotions that they're under. They help them manage with the problem afterwards, but they don't try and stop them. I mean, in this circumstance, they're dealing with much more severe mental health issues and much more serious problems. But fundamentally, what the same sort of principle applies is that you're taking away a person's means of coping and dealing with their issues.
Yeah.
Because again, fundamentally, that is why they are probably engaging with the gamble in the first place. Is there's a problem, and they're trying to address it. It's when it obviously gets so severe that you're dealing with a lot of very sensitive individuals then, who can no longer get the same amount of gratification that they previously would, and so they still need that gratification, and they still need that relief, and they're going to find it some way or another.
Well, listen, it's been great to talk to you about this. It's been really insightful. I've learned a lot of new things, which has been great. So thank you very much for coming on to here to talk about this topic.
No problem. Yeah.
That's it for today's episode of Football the Imperfect Game. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to, whether that be Apple Podcasts or Spotify, so you don't miss any upcoming episodes of the show. That's it from me, your host, Michael. Thank you for listening.